Do you know when people are asked if they're good listeners, consistently over 90% of people respond yes, they are good listeners? I don't know about your experience, but in my experience, 90% of the people I encounter do not demonstrate good listening skills. So where is the disconnect? Why is it that most people believe they're good listeners when in reality many people are not? Part of the reason for this will be explained in this presentation from Chapter 7 on the challenge of listening. In this brief presentation, we'll focus on some of the common obstacles we experience that make listening difficult, and also review some poor listening habits that we may fall prey to when listening. While listening is important, we must also realize that listening is not easy. One of the reasons people may believe they're good listeners when they're not is because they may confuse hearing and listening. Many people may have the opinion, because I can hear, I'm a good listener. However, we know that hearing is a physiological process. As long as we have ears that work, we hear 24 hours a day with no effort. Listening, however, requires effort and making choices. When we truly try to listen, to be attentive to messages, we sometimes experience obstacles that challenge our attentiveness. These obstacles include information overload, personal concerns, rapid thought, and noise. The first obstacle, information overload, deals with the amount of information we're trying to take in and process. Students are often too familiar with this obstacle. In high school, you're often challenged to listen for 5 to 7 hours a day while in class. In college, as you're likely aware, you have 3 classes in the same day. It's easier to pay attention in your first class than in the last, because our minds can only process a given amount of information. When we're subjected to information overload, our minds need a break, and that is when we fall into mindless listening or other distractions. The next obstacle is personal concerns. Maybe you're having trouble paying attention in your biology class because you have a history midterm later in the day. Maybe you're zoning out while listening to your friend complain about her boss because your grandmother was admitted to the hospital a couple of days ago and is in poor health. For these and a variety of other reasons, we may allow our minds to be preoccupied with personal concerns, which influences our ability to give full attention to other messages. In these situations, we often fall into mindless listening as well. The third obstacle is called rapid thought and deals with our mind's ability to process information. If we base our ability to process information on reading speed, we find that most adults are able to read in the range of 400 to 600 words per minute. When we compare this to the normal speaking rate, most people speak at a rate of 100 to 150 words per minute. As you can see, when we compare how much information our mind can process to the amount of information we receive when listening, there's quite a disparity. Also, we need to understand that our minds prefer to operate at maximum capacity, so when our minds are not receiving enough information, they'll find other things to occupy them. These are times when we may become distracted from the message by external factors, or we begin to daydream or think about what we want to say next, rather than continuing to give our full attention to the speaker. The final obstacle is noise. As we learn from the model of communication discussed in Chapter 1 of our text, noise is anything that can interfere with the communication process. This includes not just physical noises that may distract us from the message, but also physiological noise, like being tired, hungry, too hot, or too cold, and psychological noise, such as our predisposition toward the speaker or predisposition toward the topic. Now that we're familiar with some of the common obstacles in listening, it's also important to be aware of some of the poor listening habits we may demonstrate from time to time, and consider the effects of these listening habits on the speaker. The 7 poor listening habits are pseudo-listening, stage hogging, selective listening, filling in gaps, insulated listening, ambushing, and defensive listening. The first, pseudo-listening, is fake listening. It is giving the appearance of listening, but not actually processing the information. Pseudo-listeners may make eye contact with the speaker and even provide subtle nonverbal feedback, but the message is going in one ear and out the other. Stage hogs are listeners who are always sending the message, "Look at me." Stage hogging listeners are self-centered listeners who only pay attention to your message so they can figure out how it relates to them so they can make the conversation about them. Selective listening is hearing only parts of the message that interest you or relate to you and ignoring other parts of the message. If a child asks a parent if they can go swimming with their friends and the parent replies, "Yes, you can go swimming after you clean your room," the selective listener will only hear the first part, "Yes, you can go swimming," and ignore the second part of the message about cleaning their room. Listeners who fill in the gaps fail to accept that they do not remember all of the story. When they retell the story or information to another person, they create additional information rather than admitting they don't know the whole story. The result is the message is a distorted version of the original. Insulated listening is pretending not to hear parts of the message that we don't want to respond to. In a relationship, perhaps one person mentions something that the other person did that made them angry. The listener then pretends not to hear the message so they don't have to address the conflict. I think we see insulated listeners a lot when listeners are engaged in something else like watching TV or in a conversation with another person where it's plausible that they may not have heard the message. Where the insulated listener is looking for opportunities to avoid conflict, the ambushing listener appears to be focused on finding points in the conversation where they can attack the ideas, values, or beliefs of the speaker. Ambushing listeners do tend to listen closely to the message, but only for the purpose of finding something they can attack. Our final poor listening style is defensive listening. Defensive listeners are frustrating to communicate with because they perceive most messages as personal attack and respond accordingly. Defensive listeners are often people who suffer from low self-esteem or shaky self-images. Listening and becoming a better listener is a process. However, becoming more aware of the possible obstacles we may encounter when listening and learning how to avoid or overcome these obstacles, and being aware of poor listening habits we may demonstrate are 2 steps to becoming more effective informational and relational listeners.